"Happy anniversary, sweetheart," my wife whispered with tears in her eyes as the police officers stepped through the front door and asked me to stand up. I remember those words more clearly than anything else because they were the last loving words Linda Walker ever said to me before she tried to destroy my life. 40 years. 40 years of marriage. 40 years of birthdays, Christmas mornings, road trips, and family dinners. 40 years of believing I knew the woman sitting across from me. I was 68 years old that evening. Our son Daniel had reserved a private room at a steakhouse outside Columbus, Ohio, to celebrate our 40th wedding anniversary. The room was decorated with white roses. There was a framed photograph from our wedding day sitting near the cake. Linda had chosen it herself. She wore the same pearl necklace I gave her back in 1998. She even smiled when she looked at me. I thought we were happy. Maybe not perfect, but happy enough. Daniel and his wife Amanda sat across from us. Amanda was chatting about their upcoming trip to Tennessee. Daniel barely touched his food. I noticed that. He stared at his glass of iced tea and kept checking his watch. I assumed he was tired from work. I had no idea something was weighing on him. Linda squeezed my hand and smiled. 40 years, Tommy, she said softly. Not everyone gets that lucky. I smiled back. And I'd marry you all over again. She looked down, almost guilty, but I dismissed it. Love makes fools of people, even old men. Dessert had just arrived when two men and a woman walked into the room. At first I thought they were lost. Then I saw the badges clipped to their jackets. The room became strangely quiet. Amanda stopped talking. Daniel lowered his eyes. One of the officers asked, "Thomas Walker?" I nodded. "Sir, we need you to come with us." I laughed nervously. There must be some mistake. The woman opened a folder and calmly explained that allegations had been filed involving financial misconduct and witness statements had been provided. My smile disappeared. I looked around the room. I expected confusion, shock, questions. Instead, I found something else. Linda began crying immediately. Not loud, just enough to appear heartbroken. She held her chest and whispered, "Thomas, why didn't you tell me?" I stared at her. Tell you what? She wouldn't look at me. Amanda covered her mouth. The waiter quietly disappeared. Daniel remained completely silent. I felt cold despite the warm room. "Linda," I said, "what is happening?" She shook her head and wiped her eyes. "I don't know who you are anymore." Those words hit harder than anything else. 40 years reduced to one sentence. I looked at Daniel. My son. My only child. 39 years old. Smart. Honest. Quiet. He sat perfectly still. No tears. No anger. No questions. Just silence. And for some reason, that silence hurt more than anything else. I thought he believed the accusations. I thought he was ashamed of me. I thought I had already lost my son. As I stood up, one officer offered to let me finish my coffee. I shook my head. My appetite had disappeared. I picked up my suit jacket and glanced one last time at the wedding photograph sitting beside the untouched cake. 40 years. Reduced to paperwork and accusations. Linda lowered her eyes. Daniel finally looked up at me. His expression was strange. Not hatred. Not disappointment. Something else. Something I couldn't understand. As I walked past him, he quietly reached into his pocket and closed his hand around something. I didn't know it then, but for 3 years my son had been carrying secrets heavier than I could imagine. And while I believed I was losing everything that night, Daniel had already been waiting for this moment longer than anyone knew. The holding room smelled like old coffee and floor cleaner. I sat alone beneath a humming fluorescent light and stared at my wedding band. 40 years. I twisted it around my finger over and over again, trying to understand how a celebration had turned into this nightmare. Nobody had raised their voice. Nobody had explained anything. Everything had simply happened. Quietly. Like rain falling through the night while you sleep. A young officer handed me a paper cup filled with lukewarm coffee. I thanked him. He nodded politely and walked away. I did not drink it. I just held it between my hands. The warmth felt comforting. My thoughts did not. Around midnight, I was finally allowed a phone call. I dialed Linda's number first. Straight to voicemail. I tried again. Nothing. Then I called Daniel. He answered immediately. "Dad." His voice sounded calm. Too calm. "Daniel. Son. What is happening?" There was a pause. "I am working on it." I closed my eyes. Working on what? Another silence. "Just trust me. Trust me." Those words should have made me feel better. Instead, they left me feeling even more alone. By sunrise, I had not slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Linda crying at the restaurant. I heard her saying she did not know who I was anymore. I remembered our first apartment in Dayton. We had barely enough money to afford groceries back then. Linda used to laugh while making grilled cheese sandwiches in our tiny kitchen. We dreamed together, built together, raised Daniel together. I remembered the nights we stayed awake with him when he had the flu. I remembered teaching him to ride his bike. I remembered Linda sitting beside me in church every Sunday. I remembered every anniversary card she ever gave me. How could all of that disappear? By late morning, attorney Richard Barnes arrived. We had known each other for 20 years. He sat down and removed his glasses. He looked tired. Thomas, I have reviewed the documents. And several people made statements against you. I stared at him. People. He nodded slowly. 3 witnesses. Who? I do not know them personally. I laughed quietly. Not because it was funny, because it sounded ridiculous. 3 strangers had more influence over my life than 40 years of marriage. Richard folded his hands together. There are also records involving financial transactions. Transactions I never made. I know. Then why am I here? Richard sighed. Because right now, appearances matter. Appearances. I leaned back in my chair. Outside the small window, rain had started falling. Gray clouds covered the sky. I suddenly thought about Daniel. He had barely spoken at dinner. He had not looked surprised when the officers walked in. He had not argued. He had not defended me. And yet, when I called him, he answered immediately. Not Linda. Not Amanda. Daniel. I remembered his strange expression when I stood up at the restaurant. There had been no anger in his eyes. No shame. Just something heavy. Something tired. Around 3 in the afternoon, Richard packed his files and stood up. I will do everything I can. I nodded. He hesitated near the door. Your son called me this morning before I arrived. I looked up. Daniel. Richard smiled faintly. Yes. He sounded very determined. About what? Richard adjusted his glasses. He said something interesting. I swallowed. What? Richard looked directly at me. He said his father had trusted the wrong person for 40 years. But he had been preparing for this day for 3. Then he quietly walked out, leaving me alone with a cold cup of coffee and a question that suddenly mattered more than anything else. Preparing for what? Richard's words stayed with me long after he left. I sat alone and stared at the empty chair across the room. Preparing for this day for 3 years. I repeated the sentence over and over in my mind. None of it made sense. Daniel had always been quiet. Even as a boy, he preferred listening over talking. When other children fought, Daniel stayed silent. When people lied, he simply watched. His mother used to say he noticed things other people missed. Back then, she said it with pride. I wondered if she still would. Around 6 that evening, I was finally transferred to another room with a small bed and a narrow window. Rain still covered the sky. I sat down and loosened my tie. It was the same navy tie Linda had bought me for our 35th anniversary. I almost laughed when I realized that. Some memories suddenly felt poisoned. My phone privileges were limited, but just before dinner, I received another call from Richard. His voice sounded different, more focused. Thomas, I need to ask you something strange. Go ahead. 3 years ago, did Daniel and Linda have some kind of disagreement? I thought for a moment. Then I remembered Thanksgiving. Daniel had left early that year. Linda was upset for days. She claimed he had become disrespectful. I never asked questions. I assumed it was stress from work. They argued once, I answered. Nothing serious. Richard remained quiet. Are you sure? I closed my eyes and searched my memory. Suddenly, another moment surfaced. Christmas 2 years earlier. Daniel had arrived late. Linda barely spoke to him all evening. Amanda looked uncomfortable. After dessert, Daniel left before everyone else. Linda cried afterward and told me our son had become distant. I believed her. Every time. I do not know, I admitted. Maybe there was more. Richard sighed. Daniel asked me to request some records tomorrow. Records? He was very specific. About what? Security footage. Financial statements. Cell phone logs. I frowned. Why? Richard paused. Because apparently he has been keeping notes. Notes? For years. I sat up slowly. Richard, what are you telling me? I am telling you that your son does not seem surprised by any of this. The line became quiet. And honestly, Thomas, I think he stopped trusting someone a long time ago. After the call ended, I could not sleep. My mind drifted back through the years. Small moments. Tiny things I had ignored. Daniel asking strange questions. Daniel checking security cameras after family gatherings. Daniel offering to install backup drives in the house. Daniel insisting on updating my computer passwords. I remembered laughing about it. You worry too much, son. He always smiled politely, but he never argued. Around midnight, another memory came back to me. 3 years earlier, Linda and I were having dinner when Daniel stopped by unexpectedly. He had forgotten his laptop after helping me with the garage cameras. Linda had been on the phone when he walked in. I remembered her face changing when she saw him. She ended the call immediately. Later that evening, she complained that Daniel had become suspicious and nosy. I defended her, of course. I always defended her. I rolled over and stared at the ceiling. 40 years of marriage had taught me how Linda laughed, how she smiled, how she drank her coffee, but maybe I had never learned how she lied. Somewhere outside, thunder echoed across the sky. I closed my eyes and whispered a prayer I had not spoken in years. Not for myself, for my son. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized something that frightened me even more than the accusations. Daniel had not started preparing after I was accused. He had started preparing long before any of this happened. And whatever he had seen 3 years ago had changed him forever. The next morning, I woke up with a stiff neck and the strange feeling that my entire life had become someone else's story. A guard slid breakfast through the slot in the door. Scrambled eggs, toast, and weak coffee. I barely touched any of it. I sat near the small window and watched sunlight break through the clouds. For the first time in 2 days, the rain had stopped. Around 10 o'clock, Richard Barnes arrived again. He looked different, not worried, focused. He sat down and placed a legal pad on the table. "How are you holding up?" he asked. I smiled weakly. "I have had better anniversaries." He nodded. "Daniel has been busy." I looked up immediately. "Did you talk to him?" "Twice this morning." "And?" Richard leaned back. "Your son does not talk much. But when he does, he means every word." I noticed something unusual. Richard was almost impressed. "What did he say?" Richard opened his notebook. "He asked me to request financial records going back 4 years. 4 years. And cell phone logs. Security footage. Email archives. Property documents. Insurance files." I frowned. Why would he know where to look? Richard remained quiet for a moment. "That is exactly what I asked him." I leaned forward. "What did he say?" Richard adjusted his glasses. "He told me he stopped trusting his mother 3 years ago." My stomach tightened. 3 years. Again. That number kept appearing. Richard continued. "Apparently something happened back then." I closed my eyes. Memories started surfacing. Little things. Things I dismissed. 3 years earlier, Linda had suddenly become interested in our finances. She wanted access to accounts she had never cared about before. I thought she was simply planning for retirement. She suggested updating the will. I thought she was being practical. She insisted on changing insurance beneficiaries and reviewing our assets. I praised her for being organized. Then there was Daniel. He had argued with her several times. Nothing dramatic, just uncomfortable moments. I remembered one Sunday afternoon. Daniel came over to help me install shelves in the garage. Linda had gone shopping. We spent almost 4 hours together. As we cleaned up, Daniel suddenly asked, "Dad, if anything ever seemed wrong, would you tell me?" I laughed. "Wrong with what?" He hesitated. "Anything." I smiled. "Son, your mother and I have been married almost 40 years. There is nothing to worry about." I remembered his face. Disappointed. Not angry. Just disappointed. He nodded and changed the subject. I never thought about that conversation again. Until now. Richard interrupted my thoughts. "Thomas, there is something else." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a photograph. "Daniel sent me this." I stared at it. It showed the security cabinet inside my garage. I recognized it immediately. Daniel installed it himself years ago. "Why is he showing you that?" Richard smiled slightly. "Because according to your son, everything started with that cabinet." I looked closer. There was nothing unusual, just tools and storage boxes. "I do not understand." Richard tapped the picture gently. "Neither did I." He paused. "Until Daniel said there is one box inside that cabinet you have never opened." I stared at him. "One box?" "Yes." "What is inside?" Richard folded the photograph and slipped it back into his case. He would not tell me over the phone. "Then what did he say?" Richard stood up and gathered his papers. He looked directly at me. "He said that box contains the reason he never stopped believing in you." Then he smiled faintly. "And Thomas, I have practiced law for 35 years. I have seen desperate people and hopeless cases. But I have never heard a son speak about his father the way Daniel speaks about you. After Richard left, I sat alone and thought about that old garage cabinet. I had opened it hundreds of times. I knew every wrench, every screwdriver, every Christmas decoration inside. Or at least I thought I did. Somehow, for 3 years, my son had been carrying something inside my own house. Something important enough to protect. Something powerful enough to make a seasoned attorney smile again. And for the first time since that terrible night, I felt something I had almost forgotten. Hope. On the 4th morning, I finally saw Daniel. Richard had arranged a private meeting room, and when my son walked through the door, I almost did not recognize him. He looked exhausted. His eyes were red. His beard had grown out. He wore the same gray jacket he always used when working late nights. But what caught my attention was not his appearance. It was the expression on his face. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he sat down quietly across from me. I noticed his hands. They were trembling slightly. I had only seen that once before. The day his mother underwent surgery 20 years ago. "Dad," he said softly. I smiled. "You look terrible." He laughed quietly. "You always know how to make me feel better." We sat in silence. There were 1,000 questions inside my head, but only one mattered. "Why did you say you were preparing for this?" Daniel lowered his eyes. He rubbed his wedding ring with his thumb, something he always did when nervous. "Because I knew this day would come." I stared at him. "You knew?" He nodded. "Not exactly like this, but I knew she would try something eventually." I felt my chest tighten. "Your mother?" Daniel closed his eyes for a second. "Please do not make me say things I have spent 3 years trying not to say." I swallowed hard. "Daniel, help me understand." He looked up. His eyes were filled with sadness, not anger. 3 years ago, I heard something I was never supposed to hear." He stopped. "And after that, I could never look at Mom the same way again." I leaned forward. "What did you hear?" He shook his head slowly. "Not yet. Son, I need answers. And I need you to trust me." His voice cracked. "Just once. Please." I sat back and studied his face. Suddenly, I was no longer looking at the 39-year-old engineer sitting across from me. I saw the little boy who used to run into my arms after baseball games. The teenager who called me every night from college. The young man who cried when his daughter Emily was born. My son. The same son I thought had abandoned me for days earlier. "I am sorry," I whispered. He frowned. "For what?" "For thinking you believed them." Daniel looked away immediately. Tears appeared in his eyes. "Dad, I stopped sleeping 3 years ago because I was afraid this day would come. I kept records. I installed backups. I saved everything. I argued with Amanda. I nearly lost my marriage because I refused to let this go. And every single day, I prayed I was wrong." He wiped his eyes quickly. I wanted to be wrong so badly. Neither of us spoke. Finally, he reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small silver key. He placed it carefully on the table between us. "Do you recognize this?" I picked it up slowly. It looked familiar. Then I remembered. The garage cabinet. Daniel nodded. "The hidden box." "Yes." "What is inside?" He looked down. 3 years of my life. I stared at him. "Daniel." He raised his hand gently. "Not today." His voice became firm. "Richard is reviewing everything. We have to do this right." I nodded. He stood up and adjusted his jacket. Before leaving, he stopped near the door. "Dad." "Yes." He smiled weakly. "I know what she said at the restaurant hurt." I lowered my eyes. 40 years is hard to throw away. Daniel looked at me with tears in his eyes. "No, Dad." His voice almost broke. 40 years is hard to fake. And after he walked away, I sat there holding that small silver key in my hand, suddenly wondering how many lies had been hidden inside my own home while my son quietly stood guard over the truth. 2 days later, Richard visited me again. This time, he was smiling. Not the polite smile lawyers use when they have nothing good to say. A real smile. He sat down slowly and placed his briefcase on the table. For a moment, he simply looked at me. Then he shook his head. "Thomas, your son is something else." I smiled weakly. "That is what his kindergarten teacher used to say." Richard laughed quietly. "No, I mean it. I have never seen anything like this." He opened his briefcase and removed a yellow legal pad covered with notes. Daniel finally opened the box. My heart skipped. What was inside? Richard leaned back. "Everything." I frowned. "Everything." He nodded. hard drives, flash drives, backup phones, printed bank statements, copies of emails, home security footage, audio files, receipts, pictures, organized by year. I stared at him. My God. Richard shook his head slowly. No, Thomas. Your son. He handed me a photograph. It showed Daniel sitting on the floor of my garage. The old cabinet stood open behind him. Around him were dozens of labeled boxes. Every folder had dates written carefully in black marker. Daniel had spent 3 years building an archive. 3 years. I could barely process it. Why? I whispered. Richard removed his glasses. Because he believed you would need it someday. Tears filled my eyes. I lowered my head. I failed him. No. Richard's voice became firm. Thomas, your son spent 3 years protecting a father who never stopped loving his mother. That is not failure. That is loyalty. I wiped my eyes and forced myself to breathe. What did he find? Richard opened another folder. Enough to make me stop sleeping last night. He pointed to several pages. Transfers. Messages. Inconsistencies. Dates that do not match statements. Calls between people who claimed they never met. I looked at the papers. And Richard smiled. And Daniel documented all of it. My hands trembled. How? Richard laughed softly. Because your son is stubborn. He looked at me carefully. Do you remember those security cameras he insisted on installing? I nodded. Yes. He kept backups. Backups. Every month. Richard opened another file. Do you remember when Linda asked you to replace your computer? Yes. Daniel saved the old hard drive. I stared at him. He saved everything? Richard smiled. Apparently, he trusted technology more than people. I laughed quietly for the first time in days. Then Richard became serious. There is one thing you need to know. I looked up. What? He folded his hands together. 3 years ago, Daniel came to my office. My eyes widened. 3 years ago? Yes. Why? Richard smiled sadly. He asked me a question. What question? Richard looked directly into my eyes. He asked what he should do if one parent was lying to the other. I felt my chest tighten. What did you tell him? Richard sighed. I told him accusations without proof destroy families. And he nodded and thanked me. Richard paused. Then he said something I will never forget. I swallowed. What? He said he hoped I was right because he loved his mother and did not want to believe what he had heard. Richard looked down at the papers. But he also said if he was wrong, he would spend the rest of his life apologizing. And if he was right, he would spend the rest of his life protecting his father. Silence filled the room. I covered my eyes with my hand. I remembered all the times I told Daniel he worried too much. All the times I defended Linda. All the times I failed to see his pain. Richard stood up and closed his briefcase. Before leaving, he smiled. Daniel is meeting with me again tonight. For what? Richard grinned. Apparently, he found something yesterday that made him stop talking for 20 minutes. I looked up slowly. Something new? Richard nodded. And judging by his face, Thomas, I think someone out there is about to have a very bad week. 3 days later, I noticed something had changed. Not inside me. Outside. Richard's visits became shorter. His smile became bigger. And Daniel stopped looking exhausted. He still looked tired, but there was something else now. Confidence. On Friday morning, Richard arrived carrying coffee and 2 blueberry muffins. That alone made me nervous. Lawyers never bring pastries when life is falling apart. He sat down and slid one toward me. Eat. I laughed. That good. He smiled. That good. I picked up the muffin. Tell me. Richard opened his briefcase and removed several papers. One of the witnesses changed her story. I froze. What? He nodded. Carla Benson. I remembered the name. One of the strangers who claimed she had knowledge about transactions I supposedly made. What happened? Richard smiled. Daniel happened. I frowned. Daniel talked to her? No. Richard laughed softly. Your son simply sent documentation to her attorney. I stared at him. That is all. That was enough. Richard pointed to the papers. Turns out Ms. Benson suddenly remembered some details incorrectly. I sat there in silence. Richard continued. Then another witness asked to revise his statement. Another one? He nodded. Funny how memories improve when facts appear. I almost smiled. Almost. But something still bothered me. And Linda? Richard's expression changed. Still denying everything. I lowered my eyes. Somehow, that hurt more than the accusations. 40 years. And she still refused to tell the truth. Richard stood up and stretched. Daniel found something else. I looked up immediately. More recordings? No. He smiled. Better. Better than 3 years of recordings? Richard grinned. Apparently. He handed me his phone. Look. It was a photograph. Daniel sat in his office. Amanda stood beside him holding coffee. There were papers spread across the table. But what caught my attention was Emily. My granddaughter. 9 years old. She sat in the corner coloring pictures. Why is Emily there? Richard smiled warmly. Because Daniel has not been home much lately. I looked at the picture longer. Amanda was smiling. Emily looked happy. My son looked exhausted. But they were together. Amanda knows? Richard nodded. Everything. I swallowed hard. And she stayed. Richard laughed quietly. Thomas, your son married a good woman. I smiled. Thank God. Richard sat down again. Actually, Amanda said something interesting yesterday. What? She told Daniel she fell in love with him because he protects people. I looked away. Suddenly my eyes felt heavy. And what did Daniel say? Richard smiled. He said he learned that from his father. I could not speak. For several seconds, neither of us said a word. Finally, Richard cleared his throat. By the way, Linda has been making a lot of phone calls. I looked up. To whom? Everyone. And people are not answering. I frowned. What do you mean? Richard opened another folder. Apparently somebody shared some information with the right attorneys. Daniel. Richard smiled. Who else? I leaned back slowly. She is scared. Richard nodded. Terrified. I stared out the window. The sky was blue for the first time in over a week. Then Richard became serious. Thomas, there is one more thing. What? He looked directly at me. Daniel finally listened to one recording that he avoided for 3 years. I frowned. Avoided? Yes. Why? Richard lowered his voice. Because he said it was the one recording that broke his heart. I felt cold. What is on it? Richard stood up and picked up his briefcase. I do not know. You did not hear it? No. He smiled sadly. Your son said some things belong between a father and a son first. Then he stopped near the door and looked back at me. But judging by his tears yesterday, Thomas, whatever is on that recording changed everything. The following Monday, Daniel came to see me again. This time, he looked different. Not exhausted. Not angry. Just sad. He sat down slowly and placed a paper cup of coffee in front of me. Still too much cream? He asked with a small smile. I smiled back. Still too much. We both laughed quietly. It felt strange. Normal. Like old times. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel reached into his jacket and placed a flash drive on the table. He stared at it like it weighed 50 pounds. Dad, he said softly. I listened to it. I knew immediately what he meant. The recording. The one he avoided for 3 years. I swallowed. And he closed his eyes. I wish I had not. Silence filled the room. Finally, he pushed the flash drive toward me. Richard says you should hear it. I looked at him carefully. Did it change anything? Tears appeared in his eyes. No. His voice cracked. It changed me. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. Son. He lowered his head. Do you remember the night I forgot my laptop? I nodded slowly. 3 years ago. Yes. He forced himself to breathe. I came inside and heard Mom talking. His eyes filled with tears again. She did not know I was there. I felt my chest tighten. Daniel stared at the table. At first, I thought she was joking. He shook his head. Then I realized she was serious. I said nothing. I remember standing there with my hand on the kitchen wall, trying to understand what I was hearing. He wiped his eyes. I wanted to walk away. I wanted to forget it. I wanted to pretend I heard wrong. But you did not. He shook his head. No. He smiled sadly. Because I heard her say your name. My hands trembled. Daniel. He raised his hand gently. Do not ask me what she said. Why? Because no son should hear those words about his father. Tears rolled down his face. And no husband deserves to hear them from his wife. I looked away. My eyes burned. Daniel continued quietly. For 3 years, I hated myself. Why? Because every birthday dinner, every Christmas, every family photo, I knew something you did not. His voice almost disappeared. And every time you smiled at her, I felt guilty. I shook my head immediately. No, Dad, no. I squeezed his hand. You protected me. He began crying openly. I should have told you sooner. And destroyed your mother without proof. I smiled sadly. That is not who I raised. He covered his face. I prayed every night that I was wrong. Neither of us spoke. Finally, He handed me a pair of earphones. You do not have to listen now. I stared at them. Did Richard hear it? No. Amanda? No. He smiled weakly. I wanted my father to decide. I looked at the flash drive sitting between us. Such a tiny thing. And somehow it held the end of 40 years. I reached for it slowly. Then I stopped. Daniel? Yes. After everything. My voice broke. Do you still love her? He closed his eyes. Tears rolled down his cheeks. She is my mother. He smiled sadly. I do not know how to stop loving her. Then he looked at me. But I know how to stop letting her destroy people. I nodded slowly. And for the first time since all of this began, I realized something extraordinary. My son had spent 3 years carrying pain that belonged to grown men. He had protected me, protected his wife, protected his daughter, protected the truth. But nobody had protected him. And sitting there across from him, I suddenly understood that when this nightmare finally ended, the person who needed healing the most was not me. It was the little boy I once taught how to throw a baseball, who had somehow spent 3 years teaching himself how to carry heartbreak alone. 1 year later, I sat on the back porch of our little house outside Knoxville, Tennessee, with a cup of coffee in my hands and sunlight warming my face. The maple trees behind the yard had begun changing colors. Emily was chasing butterflies near the garden. Amanda was reading a book on the porch swing. And Daniel stood beside the grill, pretending not to burn hamburgers while arguing with his daughter about baseball. Ordinary things. Beautiful things. The kind of moments I once thought I had lost forever. The nightmare had ended months ago. The truth had spoken louder than lies. Richard had been right. Facts had a way of bringing light into dark places. I sold the old house in Ohio. Not because I hated it, but because I could no longer live inside memories that no longer belonged to me. 40 years had not disappeared. They simply ended. And endings, I learned, are not failures. Sometimes they are mercy. On my 70th birthday, Amanda decorated the backyard with white lights. Emily insisted on making the cake herself. It leaned slightly to one side, and the frosting looked like it had survived a tornado, but I thought it was the most beautiful cake I had ever seen. Daniel grilled steaks while singing old Frank Sinatra songs terribly off-key. We laughed so much that evening. Real laughter. Not polite smiles. Not pretending. Real happiness. After dinner, Emily handed me a homemade card covered with glitter and tiny hearts. "Happy birthday, Grandpa," she said proudly. I hugged her tightly. Amanda gave me a framed family photograph. The 5 of us stood together under the Tennessee sky. Simple, peaceful, whole. Then Daniel walked over holding a small envelope. "Open mine last," he said quietly. Hours later, after everyone had gone inside, I sat alone beneath the stars and opened his letter. His handwriting had not changed since high school. I smiled the moment I saw it. "Dear Dad, when I was 10 years old, you taught me something during Little League. I struck out 3 times and cried all the way home. You told me something I never forgot. You said real men are not measured by how many times they fall. They are measured by who they protect when life gets hard. I never understood that when I was a boy, but I understand now. For 3 years, I was scared. I was angry. I was heartbroken. But every time I wanted to give up, I remembered the man who taught me what loyalty meant. You. You taught me to protect family. I just protected the right one. Love, Daniel." I lowered the letter and wiped my eyes. Then I looked through the kitchen window. Amanda was helping Emily wash dishes. Daniel was laughing while drying plates. The same little boy I once carried on my shoulders was now carrying his own family with quiet strength. I realized something then. I had spent weeks grieving the woman I lost, but I had almost forgotten to celebrate the son I found. And perhaps that was God's greatest gift. Not justice, not revenge, not victory, but a second chance to see what had been standing beside me all along. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside my shirt pocket near my heart. Then I looked up at the stars and smiled. Because after everything life had taken away, it had given me something far more precious. Not another 40 years. Just the truth. And in the end, that was enough.